sorry. What's that? You're taking pictures, okay. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming. I think some people might still be filtering in, and that's fine, but I thought we'd go ahead and get started. Can everyone hear me okay? All right, well, let's start with the important stuff. If you're new to this building, where is the restroom? They're actually everywhere. If you leave this space and go in any direction, you will find a restroom. But the larger ones are just over there. If you get bored and decide you want to wander around, there are 2 art installations in the building right now. Both of them are photography, and both of them have a contemplative focus. So one of them, if you go straight down that hallway, are images that play with the notion of light as a metaphor for transcendence or God or the divine. And then if you turn and go down behind where we are, there's another set of photographs that is exploring, exploring the Quaker spices. So this is a Quaker church, a Quaker meeting, and Quakers have a set of values they call the testimonies, and they are simplicity, peace, integrity, community, and equality. So those photos are by this photographer, Scott Dietz, trying to look for nature images that reflect those concepts. So those are very interesting. You're free to go take a look at those. I should thank Reedwood for making this possible, and all of our guests, who I'll introduce in a moment. In the handouts that you have, does everyone have a handout? All right, so the full bios for these lovely people are there, which means that I'm not going to say them again. Feel free to check them out. And I've added websites for each of them. Often their institution, sometimes the individual, if you want to find more about them. And then if you came in after I made this announcement, there is water in the entryway. You're free to take some. There are snacks if you're feeling hungry. They're also free to take out in the lobby. So, a contemplative practice panel. Would you take a moment and take a breath with me? A typical contemplative activity. Let's take a breath together. It's very interesting how taking a breath together is different from taking a mindful breath alone. Oh, thank you. This is a plant. She's here to remind everyone to turn off their phones. I appreciate that. All right. So taking a breath is a contemplative practice. One of the more universal contemplative practices that really transcend culture or language is silence. And so we're going to dive in, but let's take a moment of silence, the deep breath, to be here right now with one another. We have a room of practiced contemplatives. We have a gathering of mystics. Welcome. All right, let's see who is here. Would you please raise your hand if you participate in some kind of meditation? Raise your hand if you do yoga. How about journaling? Wow. Prayer? Wonderful. So, maybe we switch and we'll be the audience and they can have the conversation. So we're going to have a conversation. The goal is to have a fairly open, engaged conversation among this group of people. We'll start with some big level stuff so you have a sense of who they are, what they're representing. And we're looking at people from different wisdom traditions and different contemplative practices here. We'll also come back around to check in with them on how it is they came to the contemplative practice that they practice. Then we're going to go into more of a popcorn conversation with them, exploring some questions around contemplation. And then we're going to open it up for questions from you. So, little introductions, some conversation, some back and forth. Sound okay? Lovely. Okay. Patricia, I just met a little while ago. This is Patricia. And she is a Franciscan spiritual director and teaches centering prayer. So she'll be sharing with us from that perspective. Next to her, with the mischievous look, is Juan Carlos. And I've decided to describe him, actually I'm going to use your exact words, coming from the Christian tradition but not wanting to be smothered by Christianity. And my own word for him is a mystic, a Christian mystic. There's so much more, but that's what I'll share. And we come to Lynn. Lynn, who I just discovered was a pastor here in this building at an earlier time, and is engaged in companioning. Do I have that correct?
Yes, soul companioning.
Soul companioning.
Spiritual direction.
Spirit.
And I train them. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. Chris is coming at this from a different world altogether. He's a potter, and he's going to be looking at pottery as a contemplative practice. Namdrol is one of the founders. You may not know that there's a Tibetan college here in Portland, Oregon. I believe the only one in the US that is primarily
Tibetan Buddhist.
Yes, Tibetan Buddhist, but with a serious study of Tibetan language at the foundation of this. And so she's a co-founder of that and currently a dean at that college, which I'm blanking on. Maitupa, thank you. Maitupa College, which is right downtown on the east side. It's lovely. Amazing, amazing space. And I am Sean Conley. I'm the moderator, and that's all you need to know about me. Okay. Patricia.
Yes.
Are you ready?
Sure.
Okay. Go ahead and tell us a little bit about the world you're coming from.
Okay. Well, I'm kind of representing the centering prayer world, and centering prayer is a. Do I need that? Okay. Is this better? Is that better? Okay. So I'm representing the centering prayer world, which is a Christian practice, although you do not have to be Christian necessarily to practice it, but that's the tradition from which it came out of. It was practiced hundreds of years ago, but kind of fell by the wayside with the Western intellectualization of the church, which became very dogmatic, catechesis, but was resurrected in the 1980s by a Trappist monk named Father Keating. And centering prayer is just a method or a path to contemplation. It's not really contemplation itself. It's a very simple method. The prescription is a daily dose per day, 20 minutes in the morning, 20 minutes in the afternoon. You sit, you settle yourself, and you're going to practice letting go of your own thoughts, feelings, agendas, because so much of the belief is that God lives within each of us, but we've just covered that over with all of our needs for security, affection, and control that we developed from a very early age, either due to trauma or unmet needs. And so we have this exterior self, this personality, this ego, these jobs, these roles, but that's not really our true self. So the purpose is to kind of get down into that true self. Well, where does that? It's just in the silence. The divine lives within each of us, and we practice just letting go. It's a very simple technique. You pick a centering word, or you can use your breath, and you sit for 20 minutes, and every time you find yourself engaged with your body sensations or your thoughts, you just return to that centering word or to your breath. And of course, you all practice some sort of meditation or contemplation. And I'll probably get into my story later on when we talk about how we came to it, but for many people that's a difficult route to go because we're so in our heads, and just to continue to let go of that. The premise is that eventually we will be able to move down below all of who we think we are to a place where we truly are one with the divine, and then meet other people. It's a unitive practice. And again, the goal is to get to contemplation, which is when you're just completely resting in the silence, the mystery of the silence. But that does take practice. Some people can hit that goal a lot, and other people deal with the thoughts and letting go for 20 years. I've been practicing over 20 years, and it depends on what you're going through, but that's the basic disposition of centering prayer, is to exercise that muscle of letting go. One thing I'll add is that I think it's a really nice adjunct to the 12-step program, which is all about letting go and letting God or the higher power. And in the language, we've been trying to bring it into the prisons across the country, and I'm working at Coffee Creek to kind of get it in. It's been a long process because the Department of Justice has so many barriers sometimes to bringing in something new that they're not familiar with. But where was I going with that? What was I saying? Do you remember that? Well, I totally lost my train of thought there. But so that's centering prayer, and I'll be talking a little bit more about it. Okay, thank you.
Just to clarify, I need to talk about a practice. I need to introduce
Talk about your mysticism.
your mysticism.
Any practice.
Any practice. Well, I can bring an example that might open the conversation in dialogue. That's the purpose of this. Dialogue is a good practice, but I would like to bring an example. I have one daughter. Her name is Isabel, and since when she was very little, I don't know if you have children, but the experience is there's a permanent ask about look at me. Look at me, look at me. But I realize when I just look at her, suddenly she starts like dancing or moving, or something new that started happening when I was looking at her. Something surprising, new moves, new ways of being, dancing, I don't know. It's interesting to analyze that my eyes, the way I was looking at her, make room for new things, new ways of being. And I think contemplation out of love makes room for being surprised and transformed. And I will consider that example very simple, but it's very profound for me. I didn't do anything. I just look at her, and everything happened. Without my eyes, she would have never danced as she did. Without my eyes, maybe something that is not going to happen. So without seeing out of love, there's no room for truthfulness or authenticity or new ways of living around us. So I think my my intention or my vocation or how I experience being moved in some way is about how can we nurture openness to life, completely open to life, and feel joy about it. Like I experienced tremendous joy of seeing my daughter dancing, so it's so beautiful. I can start from there. Is that okay?
She has her own.
Oh, she has her own.
You guys can share that one.
We have our own, and they have their own.
Well, I feel a little put on the spot because I know that there are friends sitting in this room that have a history and a background that far exceeds mine. And so it's wonderful to see some of these familiar faces. But I think at the heart of Friends is, they were kind of, when they began, were very much in a similar place of where we might find ourselves now. There was a lot of trauma in that culture, and people were looking for answers, and they weren't finding it in the institutional places, the religious institutions. And so our founder is, maybe you've heard, George Fox. He is a mystic. And basically he went to pastor and priest and wise person seeking answers to these deep existential questions that he had. And his words were, "There was none that could speak to my condition." The condition he meant of his heart, that unsettledness. So I guess, so from that very beginning, there is a sense of being a seeker. But it's a seeker in Friends, early Friends were certainly in the Christian tradition. I myself center myself as a Christ follower. Right now, there's a spectrum of friends so there's an openness and a broadness. But at the very center was, because there was no one that could speak to his condition except what we would call the present teacher, or for him that would have been the Christ, or Jesus. And so there was this deep longing for, where can I go? And who can I trust? And so instead of going and listening to a priest or having that authority, they sat in silence, seeking the guidance of the divine. There's different words, the light within, because for Friends, there's this sense that there is that of God in each and every one, that spark, that divine place, maybe that wholeness, that hidden wholeness, that we all are a part of the larger sense of the Creator and the divine and that loving presence. So some of the words for Friends, there's an eternal listener. So there is always one that is listening. There's a sense that we are beloved. And a lot of that sitting in silence and returning to that place of stillness or that inner sanctuary, maybe we call it the soul, is to return to that belovedness. And there's certainly a lot of messages to the contrary, with our own expectations possibly, but also in different religious traditions. So there's a real generosity of our humanness. We are humans, and that is good, and we are blessed. And so for Friends, this sense of being still moves us from a me, as we sit in silence, to a we. And that is something, and it's not just a we or a me, it's for the sake of the world. Because for Friends, there has always been a movement out towards social justice, towards righting wrongs, and so there is that impulse to hear and to follow leadings that would bring, maybe you've heard the beloved community, or there would be bringing that harmony. So yes, friends have those testimonies, which Sean listed, and those aren't easy to live into. And at the heart of friends, because they're seekers, they ask questions. They don't have dogma, and they not necessarily have a lot of theological, containers that you would find, that some would find. So it was almost at the time was an unframing of certainty in order to follow the leading of the Spirit, the leading of the divine. And that's what we certainly need today.
I'm excited to be here, and I'm excited to have friends out there. Akari, with her daughter last night, we were firing a kill, and her 9-year-old daughter was dancing and doing shadow puppets. And so I respond to what you had to say, Juan, about beholding people and feeling free and able to dance and be joyful. And I love that part of being human. Some of the harder things, when I've lost a friend to suicide, when I can't make sense of my family and my tradition, when my country hurts me, when I myself fall short of my ideals, those feelings are harder. And contemplation and being a contemplative person doing spiritual practices helps give me buoyancy and stability and perspective and clarity as I encounter this whole world of being human. I'm thinking of Gurdjieff, and he's a 20th century spiritual teacher, and one book was titled All and Everything. And I love the idea of wholeness. I like the idea of embracing, saying yes to life, being willing to risk and to fail. I was born when my parents were at Princeton Theological Seminary, and we lived on an apple farm. We're kind of poor, but we're at this Ivy League school. I grew up in the Deep South and with a Protestant Christian tradition that was very exclusive and filtered and centered around biblical authority, not the authority of the light within, not the authority of the artist who is the authority for themselves. And I studied world religions in seminary for 3.5 years. And the more I learned, the less I could make sense of things. And so I knew that I loved ceramics and clay and had worked with clay all of my life. And I had an experience in Assisi, hearing a voice. Your life's work will be with people in clay, a different sort of state of consciousness, before going to seminary. And so while I was deconstructing and taking apart with good critical tools at seminary, taking apart Christian tradition, Christian history, I was practicing with ceramics, and I was working with my body and learning about a tradition of art that was older than any of the living world religious traditions that we have, and thinking about universality and people all around the world working with clay and expressing themselves and discovering themselves and finding literal common ground, common clay. And I met a nice master potter at that point too, and he had a sense of authority about him, and there was this one-to-one transmission of a tradition that he had been involved in and he had apprenticed in and learned about. And this passing on, this sort of handing me this sense of confidence and authority, and this is good, and there was a wonderful, nurturing relationship with him, and that fit very well with my personality, needing a one-to-one relationship. I don't think everyone's like that. So I have continued to practice as an artist and as a ceramicist for 30 years since then, and set aside, went as far away from religious traditions as I could for a bit, but then in a real time of need in my personal life, you know, there was this example of my parents who had meaningful lives and had rich traditions, and you know, I didn't necessarily have that. So I've continued to be interested and fascinated with religious traditions and with pre-modern traditions and traditions that offer a sense of meaning and give people a sense of well-being. And so I'm here and excited to be on talking about contemplation. One part of the artist practice is critique, or trying to get better, trying to learn, and contemplation could be substituted for critique. But part of the cycle of making and putting things through the fire, seeing what works, seeing what comes out best, is followed by critique and doing it again. And there are a lot of iterations. And so the same happens with some of the contemplative practices. We breathe, we do it again, we do it the next day. That's my introduction.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah.
Is the microphone okay like this? Can you all hear me? A little bit closer, sure. I don't speak very loudly, so is that better? Okay. So my name is Namdrol. I'm representing Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, which I think all of us up here feel like it's a little bit strange to be the one person chosen to represent a huge thing. But anyway, I'm representing especially Tibetan Buddhism. Obviously, I'm not Tibetan. Just let me get that on the table, clearly. I grew up in the Zen Buddhism tradition, so I started meditating. Buddhism has a lot to say about contemplative practice, as you can imagine. And a lot of people still doing contemplative practice in Buddhism, which is also very beautiful. So I grew up in Zen Buddhism, which is a Japanese tradition. So I started meditating at a very young age. And Zen Buddhist meditation, contemplation, is really focused on stilling the mind and emptying the mind. And understanding, getting to a deeper level of understanding of ultimate reality that way. So I was a child, so I learned very early to sit still and meditate and calm my mind. And then in my 20s, early 20s, I met Tibetan Buddhism, and I met the Dalai Lama, and I took refuge, formally became a Tibetan Buddhist. I was ordained as a Buddhist nun for 7 years. So during that time, from about 25 to early 30s, 32, I lived in a contemplative community, and I did a lot of contemplative practice, 6 or 7 hours a day of meditation and Tibetan practices, and a lot of very intense traditional practices, purification practices, and so on and so forth. And then my life changed, and now my contemplative practice with that as a basis is focused really on motivation, which I'm happy I came to at the end of this, because I heard a lot of really amazing, heart-moving things, and I heard a lot of things that I really relate to in everything that all of you said. This idea of stillness, this idea of kind of the authority of the self to direct the spiritual practice, the idea of beholding, I love that. All of it very beautiful. So for me, where I am with my personal contemplative practice now, as trained by Tibetan Buddhists, is starting my day. I'm very busy. I work as a dean of a college, and I do many other things, and I write, and I teach, and I talk. So I don't have 6 or 7 hours a day to do contemplative practice in the traditional way, which I'm sure is the case with most people, right, in general. So when we talk about contemplative practice, I start my day with a short sitting practice, during which I reach into that well of stillness that I think we're all familiar with, as we like to call it, whatever it is, however we envision that, and touch that, and then kind of organize the rest of my day and my psyche around how I can bring that into the world consciously. So that is based, Tibetan Buddhism is pretty unique in the fact that it teaches and advocates for analytical meditation, so analytical contemplative practice. So you take a thought or a concept and you think about it and you reason through it. The idea is that the intellect is a pathway into the spiritual, right? So this works very well for me because I'm a big thinker and reader and I like all those things very much. So like, great, we get to think about it, yay. So if you think, okay, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who's one of my main teachers, says, everybody in the world wants to be happy. We're all the same like that. We all want to be happy, right? There's no difference between me and you. We all want to be happy, right? Everyone wants to be happy. Is that true? Think about that a little bit. Okay, that makes sense. That seems true. So we all want to be happy. Should we all be happy? Will our world be better if we're all happy? Really? Is it okay if I'm happy and you're unhappy? So then think about that for a little while, and then think about, okay, so the world is kind of all messed up, actually, if we look around, right? There's a lot of people who really aren't happy. And I also know then the practice takes a little turn. If I walk into a room and I'm smiling, people in the room are probably going to smile. If I walk into the room and I'm angry, people in the room will react. Their bodies will tense up. They won't smile at me, and they may feel a little bit grumpy, right? So clearly, we all, I think, understand we all influence one another, right? We all affect one another. That's clear. Therefore, in my contemplative practice in the morning, I want to be happy. Everyone wants to be happy. I can influence other people. Therefore, as much as possible, let me take my energy and focus it on making other people happy. Because that probably will work out for me to be happy too. So that's my main practice, and that's as much as possible through the day, I try to connect back to that moment. Let me focus on bringing happiness, bringing joy, bringing light, bringing love, whatever it is that another person will need, to the best of my capacity. Of course, I'm not omniscient, so actually I can't see what's going to make you happy. But I have a pretty good idea. You're going to be a little bit happier if I'm kinder to you, probably, right? So that's my main practice, and that's not a traditional Tibetan Buddhist practice. It's an adaptation of a Tibetan Buddhist practice by Shantideva, who was an 8th century saint, who taught a practice called equalizing and exchanging self and others. So it is based on something actually from the tradition, but I teach it and actually practice it a little bit differently. And I will also say that Buddhism is, I think, as all of you have found in your traditions, there is a lot of space in Buddhism for authority within the practitioner, and that is very important in this case. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. How are we doing for hearing? Are you able to hear? You'd like it a little louder. So if we can speak a little louder and speak into the mics as we go forward. I think we're going to jump in. So as I listened, I heard a lot of these marvelous contemplative words. Patricia was talking about silence, and Juan Carlos and letting go. We heard about wholeness and repetition, more about silence, but also community, seeking, stillness. So let's jump in. How is this contemplative business different from the rest of our world? So we think about ways of knowing. So there's the rational way of knowing, sort of the analytical, and you started to speak about that as part of your practice. And the sensory way of knowing, where we're sort of observing and measuring and things like this. It's a way of knowing. Is contemplative, the contemplative world, is this a different way of knowing? Is it a different way of making sense of or finding meaning in the world? And feel free to jump in and speak with one another.
So I can start with that, because I've actually thought about this a little bit. I teach a first-term class for people new to our Buddhist studies degrees that is focused on ways of knowing, epistemology, right? We call it, in higher ed, we call it Because the Buddhist tradition and the Tibetan Buddhist tradition in particular relies very intensely on ways of knowing that in our current contemporary society are not mainstream and not considered valid necessarily. I think that is slowly shifting and slowly changing, but the contemplative is one of them. Actually, in the Tibetan tradition, they say it's not actually possible to know something, unless you've heard it intellectually, thought about it deeply, and realized it, so meditated deeply on it. It's not actually, it doesn't count as knowledge until you go through all of those three stages.
What was the third stage again?
Realization, meditation.
Yeah, I could jump in there too, because I think that, you know, there's a difference between knowledge and wisdom, and I think all of the contemplative traditions have that aspect of knowledge, of knowing something, but, and Chris talked about it, he said he worked with his body, and I think that there are practices, artistic or even athletic, or, you know, all of our senses, this body that we live with is the vessel that the divine comes to us, and we bring that to the world. And I think it's kind of an interplay between the mind and our bodies and when we sit in silence and we meditate, it's kind of like I always call it like it's a baking process, like a yeast process. And in yoga, there's the belief that people can do poses, but if they don't, you know, they can spend an hour and a half concentrating on all the parts of their body and how they aligned and breath and all the flow. But it's the shavasana at the end of the practice where you lay down and all of that just kind of comes into your body. All of that learning and that experiencing that you have done and the work that you've done to kind of stretch and try to hold longer and move with your breath and really open. It's when you lay there afterwards and just let it all sink into your being that it's kind of baked in. So I think contemplation is, for me, it's like baking, and of course you've got the kiln over there that you're baking all your clay in, you know, and that kind of a metaphor there too. I'm a literature person, so a lot of my way that I approach the divine and how I process what I experience is through metaphor and analogy, and I kind of view the whole world that way. So that's how I kind of take my experience and move it into the world.
I will not say it's a different way of knowing. I feel more comfortable saying a deeper way of knowing, something like that. How can I know my daughter without love? A doctor can know her in some way, and depending what are the lenses you use to know a person, but we can know something or somebody like this, afraid, or we can know somebody like this, like a flower flourishing. Depends on the surrounding environment of love, you might know different. So I would say contemplative way of knowing is loving knowing, or knowing love. So they both go together, not separate. So it's not only an analytical mind, it's also not only, said also heartfulness. It's not only mindfulness, but also heartfulness. And I bring back what you said, Lynn, about friendship, friends. So we need to ask ourselves, which is the environment, what is the surrounding conditions in which we know each other? And I think we need to think this image like enclosed, imprisoned, or free. And another word to say is lying to ourselves or being truthful. But nobody can be truthful without being loved, because when we experience being judged, we do this. So we need loving knowing to ourselves, to our memories, and then to other people, to the world, to animals, to the forest, how we love knowing and know loving.
I'm noticing that we're working our way down, but there's no need to go one after the other if you want to just jump in, or if you don't feel like if you're next
Oh,
to
sorry,
mine and you
sorry,
don't
sorry.
have anything to say,
Yes.
feel no pressure.
Sorry, one second.
I think as you're each speaking, there's this aspect of how do we stay in the present moment and how do we listen. And I think that's one of the bedrock is why I started with the eternal listener. It's in relationship. It's in relationship with ourselves, in relationship with the divine, Christ, and relationship with each other. And there is whether we call it a force field of love or of kindness or compassion, is that opens us and almost allows us to breathe. And the other thing that I find is so important for me in finding that openness is that I have to stop and be present. And that's a hard one for a practice of contemplation. Really at the heart of all of it is this stopping in whatever way we can stop and be completely present in that moment. And one of the things that's important for me is why I sit in unprogrammed or waiting worship, we call it in the manner of friends, is because I sit in a group that we gather in silence. And maybe it's the absence of noise, but I can tell you that there is a lot of noise going on inside my head most of the time. And sometimes I've sat there for 25 minutes with all this noise or wrestling with something, and then someone speaks out of the silence. And when they speak out of this very vulnerable place, it's like speaking to my condition. And all of a sudden, I move from my head and I drop down here because they have touched me with the truth or this clarity. Talk about that stillness or that inner sanctuary. And I need to sit with those others because in order to believe that stillness is possible. So I think that's part of what's of communion or this sitting in silence is to help support us in our desire, we would say, to be faithful to what it is that we're being called or we're being asked to be or to do in the world. And I think that's what I have found is the most important part, that is because I can tell you that after 10 minutes, if I was sitting by myself, I probably wouldn't still be sitting there. I would have thought of something else to do or thought, oh, this isn't going anywhere. Because but to have this group that sits with me has been a bedrock place because there's an intention that I want to do that, but I find that I can't do it by myself, alone. And I need other people, other friends, others that are there with me to support me in that. So, is that what I have to? No, I have that to.
Interrupt our flow just to cut you off, and we won't find out what you think about contemplative knowing, because you hit on something that I'm interested in, and I hope that you will step in to talk about this. What's the difference? So much of our contemplative work is individual work. Hello. So much of our contemplative work is individual work. I often think about contemplative practice as an individual practice. And Len, you're bringing out this really important question of what is the collective? And how does a collective practice differ from an individual practice? So I'm wondering if we could dive into that a little bit. Anyone who wants to speak, and we can use this one too. Let's just pass this around.
I mean, I think I've heard from everybody here the importance of kind of integrating the other and the support of the community and the relationality of everything. And I think in my recent experience, that's really where the opportunities for development in contemplative practice are, because there is a little bit the sense right now that it's kind of the sort of thing that you sit in a room by yourself with and kind of get your contemplative jive going or whatever, right? So I think there's a great opportunity. I'd love to hear more about sitting in friend circle like that.
I like the epistemology question and the epistemic question. How do we know? And a great yoga teacher says 99% practice, 1% theory. That's meant a lot to me. At seminary, with the degrees and the dialogical knowledge and the rational knowledge, there was a contrast for me at that point with my master potter teacher, who really knew within his body how to do those things. And I appreciated that authority that he carried within his body, and I appreciated the authority of Sri K. Pattabhi Jois, the Ashtanga yoga teacher. And there's something about contemplation that is being in the presence of more than myself. Sometimes it's with other people, but in particular, it's with the transcendent. And I think that is a definition of mysticism, one person being with the transcendent. I had a little note from Joseph Campbell, who says the way of the artist and the way of the mystic are very much alike, except the way of the mystic does not have a craft. The craft holds the artist to the world, and the mystic goes off through their psyche into the transcendent. Okay for the mystic, but not so great for everybody else. And the ideas of justice, the ideas of community, the difference in the individual and the collective, the we. We say it in our language, I and we. And they are both important. And both of those ways of knowing are important. The way of knowing through contemplation is a very particular way of knowing. It's different than rational. It's often called translogical. It's different than science or monological, where you're looking at things and interacting with a particular thing, which can very, very well hold your attention. If you're working at the wheel, you have to focus right there, and if you move your hand the wrong way, you have to start over again. But the practice is to get out of your thinking, out of your mind, into the flow. And that experience of flow is an important experience to access. And it has a different way of knowing. The athletes that are in this sense of flow have a different way of knowing. They're not thinking out loud. They're not. They're knowing in a different sort of way. And
going back to you already talked about a little bit of the collective, the importance of collective contemplation, or how we do the practice with others. I consider that very important. there's no individual salvation. I like what you said, if this person is unhappy, how can I be? So there's something missing. So we are in a journey all together. I like what you said about the flow, that there's a flow. I said at some point also the notion of presence, a presence. I like the notion of presence because pre-essence, so it's not something frozen or completely defined. It's a pre-essence, presence. And I like the divine presence, all of this. It helps more, helps a lot. When you say flow, I'm thinking about a simultaneous presence. And even a simultaneous presence that is across time, that in some way is living, is moving us, and we live with us, with this simultaneous presence. So the basic symbol about this simultaneous presence is my body. So if you see my body, the other day I was in a food truck and somebody said, "Oh, you are from Afghanistan." I said, "Wow, yeah, I would love to." But I'm Peruvian. But because my color, right? The time, I don't know my eyes or my hair. So there's, you can see my grandfather, my grandmother, my mom. You see many people in my body. My body is a living memory of a simultaneous presence. Maybe my mind is creating a Juan Carlos, right? Like a narrative. But my body is saying, "What are you doing?" Right? Because we are a simultaneous presence with a lot of microorganisms around also. So it's very beautiful that our body reveals us that we walk together. We walk together. I cannot save my life without being in touch with my grandparents and all beings that subsist in my body. And even though after death, I like to consider death opposite of birth. Well, many people do that. I'm not saying I consider that only, many of you. But death is the opposite of birth, not the opposite of life. Life goes through birth, goes through death. So my body will keep revealing a simultaneous presence. So the practice is, it will be an illusion saying, I'm doing the practice by myself, something like that.
The only one thing that I have recognized in the collective is that right now it seems like there's a deep need or seeking for a shelter of belonging, shelters of belonging, and that there's lots of suffering. And how then do we bear witness? As a spiritual director, I am a collector of stories. I know people's stories, and I bear witness to their joys, their pain, also as a pastor, and those markers in their life. And to me, there's something sacred about being seen and being accepted. And so I don't know where and so sometimes that's what I resist a little bit with putting contemplation as something that is not for the collective or the greater good. And I know in a monastery, in a monastic way, there can be just being that being with an ongoing presence of prayer or goodness or flow into the world. So it's not that you can't be, that just is something that continues to, I don't want us to, people to think, well, a contemplative, you're sitting in your cell, or you're not in touch with with the things that are important in the world. And I think for myself, it's also very important to God. The climate, and I mean, so I'll just stop there.
So, oh,
Yeah, I think that, you know, there are the cloistered monks and nuns and different traditions, but I do think that the modern contemplatives are everyday people who are bringing that sense of this consciousness that we're all connected. You said bringing kindness into the world. I mean, I do believe that that's how we live our lives, and it's through the relationships we have. What are we trying to bring? And not so much preaching it, but just being it. Be that consistent listener, presence, take time to listen to people in their life, be that to every person you encounter. It's, you know, one of the tenets of centering prayer is simplicity. It doesn't have to be a big, huge deal to be effective in the world. It's just the simple looking at our daughters, our granddaughters, our children, our friends, you know, it's those, where do we practice what we believe? And as a Christian, you know, we're taught to love others as we love ourselves. And when you sit in contemplation, you know just how flawed you are as a human being on a daily basis. You have, every day you have to work on it. You're judgmental, you're this, but then you give that to somebody else too. I will love you just like I love myself. I'm a flawed human being. I'm doing the best I can. I will encounter you and I will treat you as such. I mean, that's sort of the golden rule that we live by.
so Patricia, you, oh, good.
I just wanted to speak to, can you all hear me? Okay. Yeah, take yours. Just wanted to speak to that and reiterate, actually, I should take some ownership because I think I brought this also from the beginning. Yes, I think we are all in agreement that contemplative is inclusive of the love and the being in the world and the relationship, and that is where we grow. And also just want to speak for the importance of, before we get to that point where we're able to really bring love into the world, the importance of strength and developing a personal practice. Because I think that there's many people that just want to do it that way and do it that way, but without the rooting in something, it becomes very difficult and lots of flaws can happen. So just wanted to speak to that.
One more thought. One more thought. I was, how to say, grew up with working with liberation theology with Father Gustavo Gutierrez in Peru, and so I cannot avoid this question about collective, also talking about this. So at the edges of society, whatever edge, there are people saying this is not working anymore. This is destroying many things. There are people challenging our way of understanding our identities. Like, I'm an American, I'm a Peruvian, I am a Christian. There are identities challenging all of those definitions. I'm a man. So there are people in some way at the edges, epistemic edges, knowledging edges, religious, spiritual, whatever edge. And wisdom and the divine is awakening us through the edges. The edges, people who are brave and courageous, even though resisting many types of oppression, still talking in the public about their truthful aspirations, challenge my own layers of suppressing myself. So even though I can practice for I don't know how many hours a day, I can get a little bit. I need the voices of others at the edges to keep awakening me. And sometimes in the community, everybody is so self-protective. So when I practice alone, I can also work on overcoming that protecting mechanism in the group. So I can be connected with my deep rebellions, deep aspirations, or hidden prayers in my heart that help me to move and challenge the group as a leader. So we need both, the external, the surrounding life, and the internal life.
You know, as I hear this a little bit about individual and collective, there's also a connectivity that I feel about past and present and future. And the wisdom of the past is things that we are connecting to from different places and different traditions, but deep, hard-won wisdom from South America, from the top of the world, from many different places, and over time. So the contemplative practice, in a sense, connects me with the wisdom of the earlier times, and yet time is going on, and these traditions need developing and recontextualizing in the contemporary world. And I think that the contemplative practice is somewhat of feeding oneself and being healthy. And in order to do the kind of justice, in order to do the kind of work, in order to do the kind of creative, organizing, teaching things that people of goodwill do, you know, there needs to be healthy individuals and healthy collectives.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think in addition to the practice that I was telling you about earlier, the main practice that I do on a daily basis is a lineage practice. It's a connection to the Tibetan Buddhist lineage specific to my teachers. I've been in Tibetan Buddhism for 25 years, so I have some connection. And this practice for me personally is a completely non-intellectual practice, and it is the fuel for my day, 100%. So I think this is something that, speaking about epistemology, this is something that in our own culture, we don't really, in our own speaking like to the dominant culture in North America. I know there's many cultures represented here. This isn't a way of knowing that we really understand or respect or speak to. And it is a very powerful and important one, so I appreciate you bringing that up. I don't really have much else to say about it except for that it's really cool and it's there, and I hope we all figure out how to, I agree, it's quite important. And I think we have a lot to learn from other traditions about how they carry that forward.
So you're a remarkable group of people, and you have hit on most of my questions that I was going to bring up if things got slow. They didn't get slow, and so I'd like to shift now and invite the audience to ask, and you'll note that conveniently above us are the names of the people here in case you've forgotten. So if you have a question for a particular person, feel free to say, I have a question for you, Patricia, here's my question, or you can ask the whole group. And we have a runner, you can take this mic, Mark. Let's make sure that you're using the mic to ask the questions too. Thank you.
First.
Dwight has a question about microbiomes.
Is this true, Dwight? You have a question, I see it. Okay, all right, it's going to ferment there a little bit. Yeah.
Well, I happen to see a pot that Chris Baskin brought, and I would like him to tell us about why he brought it and what we can learn from it.
Yes, I brought several, but there's definitely a ceramic language, and it's much older than written language. And this is a form from the Middle East. The Phoenicians may have made forms with this low belly and weight there. But it's fired in a different tradition, a different way. It's been fired a couple of times, over 200 hours in a wood kiln, and all of the color and the glaze and the surface has been deposited on there by melting ash and wood in the fire. And that's a tradition that's been developed in fantastic ways over 5 to 8 centuries in Asia, and has been developed a lot further in the last 50 years by artists who are working with that old process. It was on my desk, and I think it's really wonderful. It's sparkly. It's also got a lot of subtle color to it. And I think, the fact that looking at ceramic history has a lot to, and looking at history again, or to a lineage, it is something that's not necessarily practiced in what you described as the dominant culture. But it's fun to do, and I think, we can do that. And I think it's nice to be able to talk about George Fox and to talk about prophets from 2,800 years ago, and to bring important things to conversations and aspects of life that we have. So you can touch this after the conversation, and it's definitely a know by touching, a know by feeling, not just looking. And thanks, Jennifer.
Next question. You don't want to hear my questions. Paul.
Thank you. I really appreciate the different perspectives, but still talking about the spiritual reality that we hope to encounter in silence, in prayer, in contemplative, individual and corporate practice. A friend of mine back in seminary did some schooling in the Trappist tradition in Colorado. He was a Quaker from Indiana, but he spent about 6 months among the Trappists. And one of the things that he came back with was to say that the Trappist community he was a part of saw their life of contemplative prayer as the most worldly thing you can do, that they were actually changing human history by abiding in prayer, and of course doing work and other things, but also seeing it as impacting the world. So any comments? We've been talking about the contemplative life and how that's so important for each of us to take that spiritual part of ourselves seriously, pushing back against culture, which is so materialistic. But any thoughts about how contemplation and the life of prayer might actually make a difference in the world?
Yes. if in the primary culture, when we don't have the solution, we normally suppress the reality. And so we don't talk, well, it's so complex, so we don't need to talk about that. We don't need to talk about genocide here, what happened with colonialism. It's so complex. We suppress it, We cannot talk about our gender identities because it's very complex, so we suppress it. And if somebody reminds us that we are suppressing it, we suppress them, right? So we suppress reality constantly. So my experience of prayer is the skill or the experience to name the need and aspiration even though we don't have the solution. So praying, collective praying, is a truthful effort to keep naming the truth of our lives without having any solution. In the Christian tradition, we talk about this eschatological experience, about anticipating reality through praying.
Okay. I also just want to, I thought you were going to be the mystic, but it looks like I'm bringing that voice. I also just want to speak to the power of, to understanding that really there's so much in the world that we just don't know and don't understand. And just because we can't articulate how something works really does not mean that it doesn't work. And I think prayer and people doing contemplative practice in faraway places on their own and changing the world is an example of that. I also, it just occurred to me as when Carlos was speaking, I have a Chinese doctor who comes from China, a long lineage of Chinese doctors in China, and I go to her periodically. She's a shamanic healer, and really in my own experience, I'm not very much into those things, but she's very, very powerful. And I have no idea what she's doing, but I like it, and it's great, and okay. So when I go to see her, I sit down with her, and she closes her eyes, and she meditates, and she's like scanning my body, sitting on her meditation cushion. So last time I went, I asked her, what are you doing? Like, well, I've known her for maybe 10 years. What is that like? What are you doing? Do you see me inside like a screen? She said, yeah, I see it like a television screen. I said, oh, that's so amazing. Can I go to school to learn that? And she said, everybody can do this. Nobody has any idea, but everybody can do it. It's not that hard. So I think also that it's good to keep those spaces in our minds and in our lives for things that we don't understand, and to still be able to have awe and wonder at the results, even though they're not maybe scientifically, materialistically proven like that.
I'll take this opportunity to make a plug for the November visit of John Calvi, who's a Quaker healer, and he'll be coming here to talk with us. So if you want to get on our mailing list, you'll find out when he's coming. So wisdom has come up a number of times. It's not a popular concept. I'm wondering if anyone wants to speak to the role of contemplative practice as a way of building wisdom.
Start, but yeah, I want to hear everybody, of course. Well, I know the word wisdom from Spanish, sabiduría. Sabiduría comes from Latin, because the Spanish, many languages, but sabiduría comes from saborear, to you saboreas la vida, you taste, no, I don't know how to translate it. Again? Savor it, life, you saber, sabor. The food is very tasty because sabe bien, tastes good, sabe. Saber is saborear, like you are how do you say, the living deeply, vividly, things, the color, the tasting, the eyes of people, what are how the smells, everything. So saborear is, how to say, experiencing a lot. And I will add the word discernment. So we discern wisdom. Is part of the kind of contemplative effort or practice. I don't say effort is the word, but discerning wisdom is like you shake, kind of like remove obstacles to taste the thing, the treasure or the hidden treasure that is everywhere. I'm not denying suffering totally, but something is painful in my heart, but because I love something, normally like if something happened to my siblings or to my friends, I will suffer, I will be experience something painful, but I experienced something painful because I love them, if something happened to them. So underneath the pain there's love. And so if we can discerning love within difficult situations, we can remove obstacles to untie that love through discernment and contemplative practice. And I know that one thing is pain, another thing could be understood mental suffering, but that's another type of conversation. He can help us a lot.
As you were talking, Juan Carlos, I can't help but come up with, Christ said, I've come that you might have life and have it to the full. And as you were talking about with the passion and the tasting, and there's also in Scripture, you know, taste and see that the Lord is good. And come and follow me. Is this sense is that, and also the other thing came is that teach us to number our days aright, that we might have a heart of wisdom. And we have a certain amount of time, which means what we do in between those bookends is important, which is the discernment. So all of that was just kind of floating through my head, and with this sense of yes, this flowing love, and compassion is with passion, and there is this living with passion, and I think that doesn't negate contemplation at all. It opens up the fullness of life, that we have the gift of, with every breath that is a gift, that we can be present with ourselves and be present with the divine, for me, the living Christ. And I just think that's the wonder of it and the curiosity of it. And it's a never-ending capacity.
Well, I think that people in the centering prayer world believe that contemplation opens up the wisdom of the Gospels. I mean, the contemplative dimension of the Gospels is, how did Jesus live? What was the wisdom that Jesus was trying to convey to the world? And it wasn't about the laws. Obviously, he said he didn't come to abolish the law, but there was a definite contrast between the law and the way Jesus lived. I mean, so if you want to break open the contemplative dimension of the Gospels, I think that, you know, contemplating, thinking, contemplation, and I liked what you said, was that it involves our minds also. You know, we think about things and we reflect on things. That's exegesis. That's what we're called to do. And also one thing that Chris said was he deconstructed, you know, in his journey, in his spiritual journey, he has deconstructed some of the things that he was taught. Well, that's using contemplation and the tools of knowing also through his education. Does that really make sense? Is that really working? you're saying do all this and it's going to produce a good world, institutional church, but is it really doing that? And so I think that it's a combination sometimes of study, scriptural studies, theological studies, but then that contemplative aspect kind of bakes the wisdom. Like, you're kind of off the mark there.
So thank you for what you're sharing. I appreciate that. My question is, what do your practices look like in the height of crisis and suffering?
What's your practice like in the height of crisis or suffering? How do you engage with your practice? You started to talk a little bit about that in terms of the busyness of your day, too.
How does it look like when you're in crisis?
For me, I've noticed that when I'm in crisis, or when I'm advising people in crisis, it's not the moment to start a new practice, right? It's the moment to deeply dive into something that you're quite familiar with. So this speaks to the importance of regular practice when things are going well, which is a difficult discipline. We haven't talked about the discipline of contemplative practice, but there is a discipline element to it, certainly. So for me, it usually goes back to what I've done deeply and well. My main practice is compassion practice, loving kindness practice. That's the thing I'm most familiar with, and the thing I really take refuge in.
So I love that. Where does your practice work in times of crisis? And I thought about experiencing suicide of the closest person in my life, followed by, or preceded by, sort of losing the faith that I had inherited, and losing the person that I was married to, and being in a clueless place. And there was this picture walking through the woods at the Birdcliff Arts Colony in Woodstock, and coming out on Overlook Pass, there was a Tibetan Buddhist monastery, and just below that was a little Orthodox church. And in that Orthodox church, they burned frankincense and had icons and lit candles and chanted. And I helped Magic Jack or Father John build a nice baptistry there. And I would walk through the woods and get in that baptistry and wail those chants, kind of submerged. And this was looking back to a tradition that I couldn't make sense of, but knew that other people had found strength there. And so I was trying to align myself with that, and open heart, and that was following some practices that I knew had worked for other people who across time, and it was, I think of Rumi's poems, a whole section, "Cry Out in Your Weakness." And so feeling those feelings and acknowledging pain and need and is a place to start, and then cry out is my witness, my testimony, like some of the art in the back about the Quaker testimonies. I just wanted to share that testimony. I do want to speak to wisdom too, and say that I love the idea of wisdom traditions, and I call Islam and Buddhism and Hinduism and Judaism and Christianity wisdom traditions. And the Enneagram is a container, and potters work with containers. The Enneagram is a container that's big enough to hold wisdom from all of those traditions. And it includes insights from Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, from Sufi mysticism, from Desert Fathers. All of those people have worked with this tool and have invested it with some of their wisdom. I think that's a great question about wisdom, and it's hard. And that's enough.
Any other questions? Do we want to do another question, or do you want to keep working on that
We
one?
have about 3 minutes, so I'm thinking we might want a word or two from each person, and then I want to make sure we close on time. But I think many, if not all, of our panelists would be available afterwards if people want to stay. So do you have a final word or two about contemplative practice you want to share? Or something you've learned from your colleagues? And let's go from whoever wants to start. Yeah.
One thing that I noticed tonight was that many of the words that were used, like belovedness and authority, self-authority, and just no matter what tradition you're from, I love the Rumi line, out beyond the dogma, I'll meet you in the field, you know. And so to me, no matter what tradition that you follow, you're going to find this wisdom. And to me, you know, whatever your particular influence has been, mine was basically Christianity, but I so appreciate the beauty of all the wisdom traditions, and it makes me connected with people all over the world. Honestly, sometimes I feel more connected to people of different traditions than I do of my own, so I just want to say that. Contemplatives find that deep connection to other people.
Well, my word is about gratitude. I really enjoy the passion in each of us to share, to experience. I'm still with the question about the crisis, but I'm not going to go deeper, but a little bit connected with what Chris and you have highlighted about also authority. I like from the word authority, I don't know if this is something I'm making it, but author, to become author. You are bringing your pieces, you are an author, but at the same time you are building your authority through memory, because you remember techniques, but our memory is a creative memory. So I think any crisis chaos gives the possibility for change, and I think our work as contemplative discipline is to find the resilient creative memories to move on.
And I'll just add to yours is the use of our imagination, because I find that contemplative practice is that because so many things don't make sense, but there is a way for us to make meaning. And to me, the Jesuit, and I don't know his name right now, one of you might, is the definition of contemplative is often a long, loving look at the real. And I have to slow that down and say that to myself. A long, loving look at the real, which to me that's the patience of the trusting, the contemplative, is we're trusting something that's beyond ourselves. That symbols, metaphors, we can't necessarily put words to, and neither do we have to. But we know that we know that we know.
I would end with practice, 99% practice, and an affirmation of the interior of individuals and the importance of practicing with your spirit and your interior, and supporting other people who
feel that interior life and want it to roam free and bless the world.
So I'm thinking about a couple of things to end. The first is that we were just speaking in the other room before we started the session, all of us, I think Sean was there as well, about what a unique opportunity is to gather in this way and speak on this level. And we started talking about how it's a very unique kind of knowledge generation and idea generation, and I just want to echo Juan Carlos's gratitude for being in this space with all of you, and being able to start the seeds of that kind of knowledge generation in our own hearts and in our own communities and in this group as a whole. And I hope somehow we can take this forward. I have no idea how. I'll leave that to you, but I hope that it moves forward, because I think, as we were speaking earlier, the world is really ready, and things are we're in a big shifting moment in many ways, and I think this kind of knowledge will be very valuable for the world. So I think I will close on that. In the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, we start every action with motivation, and we end every action with a dedication. So I'm going to do a very short dedication, which is just that everything that we've generated here together may ripen in the happiness of all beings and in the well-being of our community and our worlds.
Thank you all so much. This was a rich, rich evening, and we touched on so many things, and there's so many things in my list that we haven't touched on. So I'm locking the doors, and we're going to stay for another hour and a half. I hope you don't mind. I'd like to close this a little bit formally, not with a benediction, but I had a few notes from Buddhists because I knew you were here alone. I had a few pieces from artists because I knew you were here alone. Let's close with a poem, a different form of art, a Windleberry poem. Speaks to the question from the back there, I think, for me. It's the piece of Wild Things. When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and my children's lives might be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things, who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time I rest in the grace of the world and am free. Thank you for coming. So I'll just reiterate, there are photo exhibits to see if you want. There's still snacks if you've gotten hungry. I heard a few grumbling tummies. I know mine was among them. And please feel free to stay and chat and look at some of this fantastic pottery.